And we're joined on the phone today by Aaron Lupton, longtime contributor to Rue Morgue magazine, and he's got a new book out. It's called Planet Wax, Sci-Fi Fantasy Soundtracks on Vinyl. Aaron, first, if you could tell us a bit about the new book here, Planet Wax, Sci-Fi Fantasy Soundtracks on Vinyl. What are the listeners in for with the new book?
Well, I mean, with Blood on Black Wax, it was a little bit more obvious because horror soundtracks within the horror community and within the horror fan base have just been getting, more and more popular. And I think the thing that really propelled the popularity of them was definitely the vinyl market, the vinyl reissue market of Waxwork and Death Waltz and all of that. And that book actually did surprisingly well. It actually did a little bit better than we were expecting. So we thought, man, we got to do a follow-up. And, the next most obvious choice when it comes to soundtracks that people are really obsessive about and listen to in terms of a genre is definitely science fiction. And so we thought, let's try it with science fiction. And I was also interested personally in the fantasy genre, and I mean sword and sorcery, Conan the Barbarian, that type of thing. So I wanted to incorporate that as well, because for a book that's really visual, I think that a lot of those movie posters and those soundtracks, the imagery really kind of pops. But I think that one of the key differences between Planet Wax and Blood on Black Wax is that with Planet Wax, when you're talking about science fiction soundtracks, you're talking about stuff that's sort of universally beloved, right? Like people love Star Wars, they love Star Trek, they love the music of Jerry Goldsmith and John Williams and that sort of thing. So it's a slightly more A-list project, you could say, than Blood on Black Wax. You're going to see a lot more sort of like mainstream titles and like large composers and that type of thing. So one of the challenges, of course, with the book was that in terms of interviews, you're basically looking at, there's three really big composers, I think, that worked within the sci-fi and fantasy genres more than anyone else, and that's John Williams, Jerry Goldsmith, and James Horner. And, two of those guys are gone, and one of them is very difficult to reach. We did try to get John Williams. We did our best, but we didn't quite get a hold of him. But we still got some pretty cool interviews in there. We got, like, Brad Fiedel talking about Terminator. We got some pretty good ones. So I think that, overall, I think this book is going to appeal to fans of the first one. I think that the design is sort of improved, and I think that it also sort of serves a little bit as a catalog of titles that maybe should get reissued, because the companies that I mentioned before, like Death Waltz and Waxwork, they haven't been reissuing sci-fi soundtracks quite as much as they have with the horror genre. So I think that you're going to see a lot more original artwork in this than you will see reissue artwork, which to me is a little bit more exciting anyway. I always like the original artwork a little bit better.
Yeah, you mentioned, the big ones out there. Obviously, it's easy to find the Star Wars soundtracks and, the Jerry Goldsmith stuff, but I imagine some of these soundtracks for these sci-fi movies might be a bit harder to find than other soundtracks, kind of the more unknown sort of sci-fi movies.
Yeah, there's a bit. It's a bit of a mix, and definitely, like Blood on Black Wax, it was a bit of a group effort where we kind of reached out to other people within the community, other sort of vinyl collectors that we know out there, and sci-fi fans that we know about, to sort of help us with that. Because definitely, like titles like The Hidden, The Running Man is a pretty difficult soundtrack to get. There's some pretty rare and some pretty expensive stuff in there. There's also, though, records that people kind of see in the record store all the time that aren't, necessarily really expensive to get, but that people should really check out, that might have gotten passed over. And I'm thinking stuff like, like the Xanadu soundtrack, or heavy metal, perhaps Electric Dreams. Those are sort of like, if you like 80s compilation stuff, like 80s pop music, 80s disco, and everything like that, there's a lot of really crazy records like that here that again, like you see in the record stores, but get kind of passed over. But really, people should really check out. Of course, we threw in some really hilarious stuff too. Like, we knew we had to put the Mac and Me soundtrack in there, and of course we put Mac and Me directly across from E.T. just for jokes.
And I know there's also a record store day version of the book coming up late this month, and that's got a 7-inch record with it, with music from the film Invaders from Mars. That's awesome. You guys were able to get that in there.
Yeah, we kind of struck up a bit of a relationship with the composer Christopher Young when we did the first book. We interviewed him just because, he's a pretty big composer within the horror genre. He did Hellraiser and Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2. Christopher Young is a really, really good guy. He's done a mix of like that type of horror stuff and also really kind of big Hollywood films that you wouldn't even think of. Like he did Spider-Man 3 and he did, even like romantic comedies like Sweet November, or at least a romantic drama, I guess you could say. But he's a really, really just down-to-earth, good guy that wants to work with people. And if you take an interest in his music, he really responds positively to that, and he really wants to work with you, and he's just kind of like wants to get down there in the trenches with you. So when we were looking at what, like the first book, we knew we wanted to release a record with it, and the Prom Night 7-inch was a big attraction for Blood on Black Wax. So we thought, what 7-inch could we release with this one? And sort of what I was saying to you before about the whole mainstream nature of Planet Wax, that means it's a little bit more difficult to get rights to things. Like it's going, you're not going to get the rights to like, the RoboCop soundtrack or something like that, or at least if you did, it would cost a heck of a lot of money. So because we had such a good relationship with Christopher Young, we looked at his films, and there was actually 3 different films that we were interested in, and we ended up landing on Invaders from Mars. And one of the reasons why we liked that one in particular is because there's a bit of a story behind it, which is that Christopher Young originally made a very experimental musique concrète score for that film. He was doing all kinds of crazy stuff. He was, taking like field recordings. He was recording, the sound of subways going by, the sound of the ocean, and that sort of thing. And I think the producers of the film just thought, this is way too experimental for what we're looking for in this film. We want a synth soundtrack. So a lot of his score got taken out of that film and replaced with a different one. And this was an opportunity for him to present his vision of it on vinyl for the first time. And he did a bit of a different mix for it because, of course, we had to get it down to a certain time length for the 7-inch. But he worked with us every step of the way, and it was, I really can't say enough good things about Christopher Young. He actually did a signing at Dark Delicacies in Burbank, California, and the artwork for the 7-inch, which was done by an artist who called herself Hag Cult, I thought was fantastic. She just nailed all the colors and the 80s vibe of the whole thing perfectly, with the purples and the greens and the blues. And Christopher Young actually dressed up in a suit where the color matched the color of the 7-inch. And so he's just that kind of guy. He's going to go the extra mile for you. So I can't say enough good things about him, and he deserves a big thank you for being involved in this project.
Awesome. It's one thing I love about the book is I find out a lot about soundtracks I didn't know about, and then you also kind of give the details on when they were released, when they were re-released. Are there still some holy grails out there, I guess, that haven't seen the light of day, or are maybe too rare to own?
There's definitely some cool soundtracks that haven't been released, and some of them, might be surprising. Like, I'd like to see Short Circuit released on vinyl. That was done by David Shire, and I think that would be a cool one. I'll give you a real surprise one that no one's going to think of: Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. The score for that one, by somebody named John Duprez, not like a super well-known name or anything like that, is actually really good. The soundtrack that came out on vinyl was really a compilation of kind of like New Jack, hip-hop type music. But his score is actually surprisingly progressive, and it has all this mix of kind of weird different influences in it, even stuff like spaghetti westerns, mixed with like, reggae and hip hop kind of vibes. And I'd love to see that full score come out on any format, to be perfectly honest. I think that would be fantastic. But again, I also think that, like the horror genre, sci-fi is a very visual imaginative, forward-thinking genre. And a lot of these if the artists out there that practice in the horror genre that work for places like Mondo, they want to kind of flex their muscles. They could even just look through this and look at some of the titles that haven't been reissued. Stuff like Return to Oz, The Last Starfighter. I mean, all of that stuff is just sort of ripe for digging up and issuing back into the world.
Well, Aaron, when do you think we saw the shift in movie soundtracks from it used to be, with full orchestras and scores, to now so many films seem to just have kind of like top 40 music, contemporary songs instead of scores by composers?
Well, I think that you're going to see that, definitely you're going to see a bit more of that depending on how mainstream the film is, because when you get into sort of like, either horror or exploitation or low budget, there's no way that those movies are going to be licensing songs to put into the film. I'm actually surprised, when you look at a movie like Fright Night, how many relatively big 80s bands there are on that soundtrack. Like, where did they get the money to be able to license all that music? So in the sci-fi genre, because you're typically dealing with, bigger budgets and that type of thing, it always becomes a formula of cross-promotion, you know what I mean? Like, okay, this song is going to help sell the movie, and this movie is going to help sell the song for the record label and for the artist and that type of thing. So I think that, when you look at, really big movies that come out nowadays, like, look at the Guardians of the Galaxy soundtrack, right? That was a huge soundtrack, tons of big songs on there. And that's what it's known for. People aren't going to talk about the score for that film. It's going to be the songs. As I get older, I think that I get nerdier and perhaps I get more boring or something like that, and I'm really more interested in the scores. I mentioned Mac and Me before, and clearly Mac and Me was a very, very commercially minded film, to the point where it was essentially a commercial for McDonald's. And the music, the music that they chose for that was obviously extremely intentional, and yet they had Alan Silvestri doing the score for it, right? Why hasn't Alan Silvestri's score made it to vinyl? That would be fantastic to listen to. I mean, he hasn't made very many bad scores, right? So I think that one is definitely worth, digging up and dusting off. But yeah, I mean, where you, like, if you're talking about that film in particular, do the fans of that film care about the score, or do they just kind of like it for its popcorn sensibility? You know what I mean? Having the songs in there, that type of thing. So maybe that's what's sort of also propelling the fact that a movie like that is more about getting the songs in there and making the film as commercial as possible, and not about sort of like this emotional or a narrative with a real emotional resonance to it that's driven by a score.
Sure. Well, going back to like films like Fright Night, it seemed like, in the 80s into the 90s, a lot of films had soundtracks that had songs from bands who appeared maybe in the film, or, bands who were kind of formed solely for the soundtrack. Is it possible to ever see, a compilation made of some of these songs, or is it just like rights fees and legalities maybe make something like that impossible?
Sorry, what do you mean? Like if you reissued the Fright Night soundtrack?
Well, just a lot of film, like I mentioned to you off air about the soundtrack for Aerobicide, that horror film, or some of these movies that just have songs that were just in the films and they were never released anywhere else. Would it be possible to maybe compile some of those songs to put out, or is that just not going to work as far as right fees goes?
It would probably be a very complicated process. There's no doubt about that, because you're dealing with multiple properties, right? And so when you look at something like Aerobicide, or Aerobicide was Killer Workout, right? That was the ultimate title to that. There's a few of those health spa slasher films from the 80s. I think there's 2 of them or something like that. But anyhow, I think with a movie that is that low budget, and you're absolutely right that so many of those movies have these bands on them. I think Black Roses is another film like that, where there's a band on it, but it's really just, members of another band and some session musicians that said, hey, let's form this band for this for this particular film. Or Shocker, right? The Shocker soundtrack that has the Dudes of Wrath on it. Although Dudes of Wrath was a little different because it's like Paul Stanley and some pretty massive musicians. But in the case of like Killer Workout, yeah, a lot of time it's some session musicians that are very talented and have worked on really big records, but the average person has never heard their name, kind of thing. And so there's nothing stopping them from just, writing a cheesy song and putting it in there. But I think in the case of something like that, figuring out who has the rights, yeah, that would be complicated. And I have a feeling that it's whoever owns the rights to the film owns the rights to that music. They probably never thought, oh, we're going to release this song independent of the film, so they probably never held on to the rights or anything like that. But that's a great idea. I would. People do mixes like that all the time. People DJ that stuff. I mean, I don't DJ a ton, but whenever I DJ Halloween parties or Halloween events and that type of thing, I'll play some scores, and then I'll always bust out, the Black Roses soundtrack and the Shocker soundtrack and that type of thing. And so people create mixes of those songs all the time, and people recognize them. But I think in terms of putting out like one single compilation, probably that would be really expensive and really complicated to do because you're dealing with like a different rights holder for every single song kind of thing.
Well, Aaron, I know last time we spoke, Blood on Black Wax was out, and you said if that one did well, you would do another book. Obviously, that one did well. I'm sure this one will, Planet Wax. So could we see a third book in the series, maybe, focusing on comedies or some other genre that we haven't touched on yet?
I would, yeah, we don't have any immediate plans. Jeff does have a plan, and I'm not actually sure where it is, so I can't say too much about it. In terms of other genres, the one genre that I would really like to see more interest paid attention to is action films, and partially the reason why I say that is because I've noticed, and maybe I come to a lot of conclusions just based on Instagram and social media, but I've noticed that a lot of people that are into kind of cult cinema are really gravitating towards the action genre, the 80s action genre, and not just big films like Predator and Commando, but also these kind of low budget films that keep coming up that no one's ever heard of before, like Hard Ticket to Hawaii and that kind of thing that are getting released on Blu-ray. Again, really a lot of visuals involved in those films and in those soundtracks, and a lot of the music is actually really good. You know what I mean? Like Jay Chataway's score for Invasion USA is phenomenal. One of my favorite scores of all time is Predator, but I kind of consider Predator a horror film as well as an action film. Probably more of a horror film, to be honest. But I would like to see something like that come out, if for no other reason than just to generate interest from the labels in order to start reissuing some of those soundtracks, because a lot of them are hard to find. I do think that one of the issues with the action genre, especially in the 80s, is that the action genre, in terms of the film, was always focused on the action hero and the actor in the film. So you're going to get into problems with likenesses if you're doing artwork, right? If you're reissuing those records, it's from a legal standpoint and a rights standpoint. You can't necessarily draw Sylvester Stallone or Arnold Schwarzenegger. You have to draw some other image, and I think that would be very distracting for people that are familiar with the film and just associate it with the actor kind of thing. One thing I can say, though, is that in terms of next projects, we are interested at 1984 in some other projects that don't necessarily involve books, and actually I'm talking to Matthew about that later this afternoon. So I can't say anything more about that, but all I can say is that stay tuned. 1984 actually does have some very, very cool projects coming up in the future. They put out a Weird Al book, but they also have something else coming out in the near future. And I think people are really going to be blown away when they see it. And we want to kind of keep moving forward in that direction. So I'm being very vague, but all I can say is that keep your eyes peeled for 1984 and what they get up to in the next year or two.
Yeah, Matt's a great guy, and 1984 puts out some awesome stuff, including your books, of course. And again, Planet Wax, Sci-fi Fantasy Soundtracks on Vinyl is coming out here end of September, but the Record Store Day version coming out the end of this month. And Aaron, it's always great speaking with you, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what you've got next. Hopefully we can speak again soon.
Yeah, I hope so too. And just I guess one final word is just that, like everybody else in the world, we're all in the same position, right? We had this book lined up for Record Store Day in April, and we were preparing for the release, and we were preparing for the marketing materials, and then the whole world shut down for a while, and we didn't kind of know what was going to happen. We were told Record Store Day was getting postponed till June, and now there's 3 Record Store Days, and so we're in the same boat as everybody else. But I just want to say thank you to everybody out there that's been showing all this interest in the book, because I actually am blown away by the amount of interest and the amount of messages I'm getting from people that are really generating excitement, and people are excited about getting the book. So it's a tough time for everyone, but we definitely appreciate the support. It means a lot to me and to everyone in 1984.
Awesome. Well, again, Aaron, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dustin.
And again, that was Aaron Lupton and his new book, Planet Wax, Sci-Fi Fantasy Soundtracks on Vinyl, is available here for a Record Store Day, and then coming up a regular version here in late September from 1984 Publishing.